Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we really appreciate you joining us for today's episode. In the show, we will be examining a bizarre and spooky ghost story that was first published in the Boston Transcript and then newspapers across the U.S. in 1896. It begins on a lonely country road and ends with a group of baffled and astonished eyewitnesses. But before we get to that, with the calendar flipping over to September, of course, we are all starting to think about the Halloween season. Halloween is one of our busiest times of the year, and this year, with our smaller group sizes, we do expect not to be able to meet demand. So, just want to recommend if you're planning to join us, think about getting your tickets sooner rather than later. Information on all the tours can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Speaking of few tickets remaining, we also had a big announcement last week that we'd be doing a public investigation at Fort Henry National Historic Site in Kingston on the weekends of September 11th and 12th and September 25th and 26th. This will be the first time ever that a public investigation has been offered at what we believe is one of the most haunted sites in Canada. Certainly our tour guides, our tour participants, and other people who have worked or lived in the fort have had very, very bizarre and documented experiences. Of course, there's a classic episode of Ghost Hunters where they visited the fort and hung out with our founder and CEO, Glenn Shackleton. Those tickets are almost gone. So if you're looking to join us for that public investigation of Fort Henry, I would suggest grabbing your tickets immediately if you can do so. Again, tickets for that event can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com, and just look under the Public Investigations tab. We'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave us a review. The headline reads, "The Professor's Ghost Story. Uncanny Tale Told by a Grave Educator at Harvard University. Matter-of-fact Yankee accompanied by an uninvited stranger." Authentic ghost stories are apt to have less point than the ghost stories of literature. Hamlet's father does not revisit the glimpses of the moon for nothing. Banquo has every cause to trouble the feast and the conscience of Macbeth, and so on. With few ghost stories, however, which come from one's knowledge, neither from literature, nor from scientific classifications, nor from merely hearsay, the case is depressingly different. Apparitions seem either very unreasonable or governed in their conduct by lines of reasoning totally foreign to any human habit. Such, at least, was the case when, about 7 years ago, a curious thing happened in a small town on the coast of New England. The incident has no rational meaning. At the same time, it produced on the people concerned an impression sufficiently marked to make it worth recording. Its very lack of meaning, perhaps, gives it a tantalizing oddity of its own. Toward the end of one August, a gentleman started a little after 8 o'clock in the evening to call on some friends who lived a mile or so away. He drove himself in an ordinary buggy, and his horse was an everyday animal from the country stable. His road, with which he was perfectly familiar, led down a hill, at the foot of which it curved toward a belt of low woods, through which it proceeded for perhaps a quarter of a mile. After emerging from these woods, it passed through a region of stone wall pastures to the village, at the edge of which his friends lived. These friends were sitting indoors for the evening. Though rather less dark than usual, it was distinctly chilly. Their house was quite new, so new in fact, that the fence which now separates the grounds from the highway had not yet been put up. In place of it was a rough board fence, of the height of an ordinary country rail fence, and had been knocked together for the moment. This structure was, however, by no means firm. The boards which composed it were hastily nailed to posts at a considerable distance apart. At 8:30 or so, the visitor arrived at his destination. He was a man of education and intelligence, and of unusually simple and regular habits. He certainly was not possessed of much imagination, nor was he generally excitable. You would have called him, perhaps, agreeably matter-of-fact in temper. His friends then were surprised to observe that he was in a state of distinct agitation. Were it not for this evident disturbance of mind, and had he been in the least inclined to fantastic pleasantry, they would have been disposed to think the tale he told them was a good-natured hoax. Whatever the facts really were, it was perfectly clear that this man had told them exactly as they had presented themselves to him. He had driven downhill, he said, without adventure, and nothing had happened until he reached the edge of the woods through which his road passed. There, he had been startled by a sudden movement of his horse, which stopped short, and apparently, in terror, shielded to one side of the road. Looking to see what had startled the animal, which was now trembling, he perceived, close at the front wheel of his buggy, the figure of a man. This man wore a broad-brimmed hat, which flapped a little over his face, and his body seemed draped in a long cloak or some other such unusual garment. Altogether, in the dim light, he had an unusual look. He said nothing, so the man in the buggy addressed him, asking what he wanted. He made no answer, and no movement whatever. Meanwhile, the horse kept edging away from him. Disturbed by the state of affairs, the driver whipped the animal, which started ahead rather wildly. It was to his intense surprise, the figure remained close to the wheel. As the horse dashed on, the figure glided on, at a pace which no ordinary man could pretend to keep up, yet without either a sound or an obvious motion. Then, as the driver's eyes grew more used to the dim light, the figure thus gliding swiftly beside him seemed half transparent. At one or two points, where the woods were thin, he could see through the thing, whatever it was, to the stone walls and the trees behind it. He whipped the horse again and again, and the horse, which seemed thoroughly frightened, went at full speed. Still, their unearthly companion glided on, until, just as they were emerging from the woods, it suddenly disappeared. That was the whole story, or so they thought. At this spot, where the thing vanished, is a small country lot covered with a tangled growth of low pines and underbrush. A century or more ago, it appears, this lot was a burying ground. Whatever the excited gentleman had really seen, his agitation was rather painful. After about half an hour, however, it became subdued under the influence of sympathetic talk, and presently he said goodbye to the company. He was to leave that part of the country the next day, and he wished to make another farewell call or two before proceeding home. So everyone took friendly leave of him, as they supposed, for the season. Not more than a minute or two had elapsed before he returned. Something, he said, had happened to his horse. In the darkness, he could not quite make out what the matter was. He should have asked for a lantern. So a lantern was procured, and the whole company, whose curiosity was thoroughly aroused, went out with him to see what had occurred. That part of the story, then, which follows, had a number of eyewitnesses. When the gentleman had reached the house, he had stopped his horse just outside the temporary board fence which separated the grounds from the public road. Finding no regular arrangements for the tying of the animal, he had taken a rather long hitching strap, which was in his buggy, and made it fast to the top board of the fence. This proved to be about 3 feet above the ground on which the horse was left standing. The reins, meanwhile, had been tucked between the dashboard of the buggy and the whip, which was standing in its socket. Thus left outside the rough fence, it seemed it was securely tied. The horse had seemed perfectly safe. But when its master had come out again, something had evidently gone wrong. To discover just what this was, the lantern had been brought and the company had come out. The light of the lantern revealed a state of things which has never been explained. What had happened was this. Somehow or other, the horse had bodily gotten over the fence and was standing on the ground inside. The buggy, meanwhile, remained outside. Of course, one's first thought was that the animal, which had shared its master's disturbance, had gotten restless and had jumped the fence. But on a careful examination, no traces of such restlessness were to be found. The reins were still tucked, not very securely, between the dashboard and the whip. There were no marks on either side of the fence, which would indicate any violent movement of the horse's feet. The fence, again, was too high for any horse to step over without hitting it, yet it bore no traces of any blow from a hoof. What is more, it was so lightly knocked together that any violent movement on the part of the horse would probably have pulled the whole thing apart, yet it was as firm as ever. In short, whatever had really happened, the appearance of things was exactly what would have resulted from an utterly impossible occurrence, namely, the lifting of the animal over the fence from the public road to the grounds within. A certain fact is the only way of releasing the horse was to unharness him from the buggy and to lead him round to the vehicle again through a gate some little distance away. In the process of unharnessing, too, it became evident that the harness had been in no way disturbed. To explain the thing at all, in short, we had to conclude that while the gentleman was making his calls and relating his ghostly experience, some mischievous passer-by had taken the trouble to deliberately unharness the horse, to lead him through the gate, and to harness him to the vehicle once more, and that, having taken all this trouble, the mischief-maker had proceeded on his way. Very certainly, no one was near enough to see the ensuing confusion. Very certainly, too, no other bit of mischief, even remotely similar, has been perpetrated in that part of the country for over 15 years. That this extraordinary occurrence, trivial and meaningless though it were, should so instantly have ensued upon the ghostly visitation of the victim, certainly made an uncanny impression on the whole company of 6 or 8 people who stood by while the unlucky horse was reharnessed by lantern light to the uninjured buggy. This process finished, everyone finally bade good night to their disturbed friend, who started alone on his homeward drive. So far as any of them have ever known, nothing further happened to him that night. One fact, however, remains to be added. No one of that company, all of whom had known him well, ever saw him again. before the next summer, he had died. I must admit, after reading this story, it made me very curious. Of course, the first and foremost question is, was this a work of fiction, or was this an actual factual reporting of an event that occurred? It certainly does fit the mold of traditional ghost stories, having some very archetypal elements, like the fellow riding his horse through the dark woods at night, past a cemetery, and then culminating, of course, with the idea that this gentleman died a year later and no one ever saw him again, thus ending any further comment on the occasion. And of course, it is not a first-hand account. The author did not witness these things himself. So I was a little skeptical when I thought about it. Now, the name of the author is included at the end of the article, and he was a man by the name of Barrett Wendell. And he was, in fact, a professor at Harvard. He even served a couple of years at the Sorbonne in France, where they named a lecture hall after him shortly after his death. Now, I found a little write-up about him in the Proceedings of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a bit of a retrospective on his life, and I'd like to read just a little of that to start to get a sense of who this man was. During the 37 years of his incumbency at Harvard, Wendell was a positive, constructive force in the fields of English composition and of comparative literature. He substituted for more formal methods a frank incisiveness of speech and an independence of outlook that challenged the interest and won the affection of nearly 3 generations of students, including T.S. Eliot. The classroom audiences who found his controversial attitude engaging never failed to perceive the wisdom, genial humor, and passionate sympathy with what is best in literature that underlay his marked and sometimes whimsical peculiarities. To the individual seeking aid, he gave of himself in generous measure, never to be forgotten by the recipient. Over his career, Wendell wrote quite a few books, including a few novels, a few nonfiction works, and other comparative literature type textbooks. The fact that this ghost story was written by an English professor, someone with a keen knowledge of literature, does make this a very intriguing example of perhaps a professional storyteller writing a great ghost story. But there is one more important point to consider here. Wendell's best-known work during his lifetime, and certainly in the 100 years or so afterward, was his biography of Cotton Mather, a Puritan priest who was involved in the Salem witch trials. This book was published in 1891. I think there are a couple important threads to pick up on here. The first, that he was best known as a writer of nonfiction, at least to the general public. Second, that he was covering a subject matter that we would include as dark history, potentially the paranormal, and the publication date, 1891. Because as we look at our ghost story, which was published 5 years later in 1896, would someone who is taken as a serious writer of nonfiction and an academic intellectual be intentionally writing made-up stories without indicating such and publishing it in newspapers across the country? It certainly is possible, but you wonder what that would have done to his reputation. Of course, we will never know the answer. But for me, I'd like to believe Barrett Wendell in his incredible account that he captured of a stranger on a lonely country road in the middle of the night and his very, very unusual horse. Thank you so much for joining us for the episode. Please be sure to visit our website, hauntedwalk.com, to get Halloween season tickets or tickets for our upcoming public paranormal investigation at Fort Henry National Historic Site. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to us. And we'd love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, all three at Haunted Walk. As always, a big thank you to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.filmmusic.io for the additional music. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.